It's translating, but make it a little louder.
All right. Hello.
Hello.
So Daniel chapter 2, we see the image that appears in the story of Daniel. We won't take the time to read that because we want to get into Revelation 13, but we'll review quickly. There is this statue that was created by the king of Babylon, and part related to a dream he had, which I think it was in chapter 1 or is it chapter 2? We still see the dream that he had. In fact, let's go. And Daniel, either 1 or 2, which 2. And later on, the king decides that he likes the idea of being out of gold, and he decides to create the whole statue in his honor. And he gets convinced by his colleague friends and the government that he's supposed to have everybody bow down to this image. And it's interesting that story shows up in Daniel chapter 2 because we see a similar kind of story in Revelation, right? Mm-hmm. That there's going to be this image to the beast and that it's going to be expected that everybody worships it. All right. One other thing I should point out is it goes from gold, which in the Bible is considered the most valuable element, down to the feet, which have a combination of iron and clay. Now the legs are iron, which represents Rome, but if you look at the feet themselves, what are they? It says iron and clay. So we see something that is valuable in our discussion today on the very last part of each dream. Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7. Because that, according to the Bible, is the end of the world. And we believe that's where we're at, right? So we should be seeing, or have seen, but we should be at least seeing maybe something still in the future, that there is going to be a iron plus clay, kingdom, I guess you would call it that, because the Bible actually refers to those last elements as kingdom. Let's look, in fact, at, if I can do this, look in Daniel chapter 2. Go back up here. How do I get out of this thing? Why is it not letting me get out?
The classic is clay.
You can get it for free. You can get it online. I use eSword in my cell phone. And so we're going to go to Daniel chapter 2. And we can actually do it in Spanish for Jose. This actually also has a Spanish translation.
Okay.
So let's go right down to the very end. Can you see pretty well if I don't scroll too fast? Where are we? Kingdom, inferior, next to kingdom, bronze. Oh, and here we are. So verse 42. Let's see if I can make it bigger. Control. That didn't work.
Okay.
Can you see that here, verse, I'm going to try to highlight it right there. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom, so you would say, okay, wait a second. We just got through seeing that there were 4 kingdoms. What were the 4 kingdoms you saw? You saw one of gold, one of silver, one of bronze, and one of iron, right? Those are 4 kingdoms. Mm-hmm. But now the Bible says, as the toes were partly of iron and clay, so this kingdom is actually a 5th kingdom. But that 5th kingdom is apparently part of the 4th kingdom. The 4th kingdom is iron. And now this 5th kingdom, it says, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. And then the next verse says, and the time of those kings, which kings? Is it all the kings at once, or are this the last kings of this 5th kingdom? The God of heaven will set up a kingdom and will never be destroyed. So if you go back then to this thing, if I can find it. Okay, I'm gonna have to make it bigger. So, if you go back to this picture, you have clearly 1, 2, 3, 4 iron. Those are the 4 main kingdoms that are described in the Bible. But in Daniel chapter 2, we just got reading is that this is described as a kingdom. So that apparently this, whatever this 5th kingdom, is related to this kingdom. But the very last kingdom on the earth before Christ returns is going to be this. It's not going to be Rome. It's something that's going to be a subset or a derivative of Rome itself. Right? Now the question is, if you look at the Bible also, in Daniel chapter 2, it talks about the iron and clay, clay and iron, and then it talks about iron and clay. So there's actually a shift in terms of which is stronger. And it looks like the ankles are one mixture, and then it looks like the toes are a different mixture, different proportion. And so just before Christ returns, it's going to have this mixture. And since they're asking us to talk about a little bit about the meaning of this, we say, well, how would you come up with a meaning for this? How would you discover the meaning of this particular statue? What would you do? What were the steps that you would take to try to figure out what this means?
Go to Daniel?
Was that?
Daniel?
Daniel, but where would you go in Daniel to find out that?
The second Daniel?
We are in second Daniel.
Interprets of dreams?
So you'd ask Daniel would interpret it, right? Mm-hmm. But he doesn't actually say, he just says the following kingdoms.
He doesn't say the head of gold. Well, actually he does.
He says it's Babylon, we know that.
He tells us it's head of gold.
We do see a sequence in history.
Yeah.
So obviously you could look at history, but what part of the Bible would give us an idea about what these last events are going to be like?
Revelation.
Well, Revelation would be a good one, but I would turn then to Daniel 7, because Daniel 7 seems to be telling us the same story all over again, but has a different ending, right? So if you turn to Daniel chapter 7, it says the first beast was like a lion, and we already know that first beast represents Daniel. We already know that part. And so Daniel chapter 7 goes through the same sequence of 4 kingdoms. The 4 kingdoms. And somebody want to read that, Megan, or
what is it? 7 what?
Just where do you find the I think it's Daniel 7:4.
The first was like a lion that had eagle wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it.
Okay, that doesn't really help us a whole lot, does it? I mean, you could think of it as being a completely different dream. If you look at verse 2, it says, 4 winds of heaven were churning up the great sea. Did you see that in verse 2?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
When it says the great sea, what is it referring to?
People.
Okay, it could be referring to people, but specifically when it says the great sea, is referring to the Mediterranean Sea.
Oh.
And so symbolically, it would be understanding as people, nations. And the idea of the winds of heaven, the churning up means there's confusion, there's turbulence, there's agitation, there's what else would you say? What was another adjective? When something is churned up, you would say the people
It's disorganized.
People are just, well, I'm not sure about they're agitated. I guess that's the easiest way of saying it. The people are agitated. So out of that agitation comes this kingdom of Babylon. There were kingdoms before, right? The Assyrian kingdom came before Babylon. We do see multiple kingdoms that happened before 600 BC. Why do we start with the Babylon kingdom? Do you know? Why does Daniel take us through these 4 kingdoms, and why does God in vision give Daniel just these 4 kingdoms?
That's where he started.
But why start there? Why not start, I don't know.
Because it was a present. It was a present for Daniel.
It was present for Daniel, but why start with Daniel?
Wasn't it
Why
the-
not start with somebody else?
Wasn't it rebellious? Wasn't it a city that rebelled?
That's a good question. Is there something about these kingdoms that are symbolically important for end time understanding? That might be one way we're understanding it. But all these kingdoms related to Daniel are related to how they affect the people of God. And Daniel was taken as captive. That was the first time, that's actually the second time. It was the first time they were taken by the Assyrians into Samaria and Babylon. But in any case, Daniel was the first one that receives a vision. You say, why did God start with Daniel? It's all about God's people. How Babylon affected God's people, how Medo-Persia affected God's people, how Greece affected God's people, and how Rome affected God's people, and ultimately, how iron and clay are going to affect God's people in the very end of time. Right? And so we need to always be thinking of the bigger picture, not just the picture that we're seeing in front of us, but we're thinking, okay, something about each of these kingdoms affected God's people, but there were different locations. So of course, Babylon is pretty much the same location as Medo-Persia, but Greece is physically, geographically a different location, right?
Right.
Greece is not the same place as where Babylon was. Babylon was. In fact, let me show you a picture of it. There's that picture. Here is the Babylonia. There's Assyria up there. This actually shows it better. This is where we see the Babylonian parts. Here is Israel down there. But later on we see Greece. Where is Greece going to be? It's around here somewhere. And then and there's Turkey. And then over there is going to be Rome. So geographically, they're in completely different areas. But they're all related they have one common denominator, how they affected God's people, right? So that makes it really kind of interesting to figure out, well, this is like a puzzle, and we're all trying to figure out how to put the puzzle together. When I put puzzles together, I always start with the edges.
Me too.
Because, and I'll let my wife put out the rest of it, and she can do the inside part. Because the edges are easy to find. So I'm a visual person, so I'm looking at this and say, okay, what are the edges of this huge puzzle that God has given to us that we call the Bible? And so if we find out what those edges are, then we can see, well, how do we place all the pieces of the puzzle afterwards? Not sure why this thing is on. All right. So we're not going to be able to answer all the questions, but I want to emphasize that we are somewhere in the history of the iron and the clay. Maybe we're in the clay and the iron part of the ankles, maybe we're in the toes down here.
Doesn't God just reference man as clay? Like,
Yeah, he does.
Potter
actually.
and
So
clay.
why would it go from kingdoms, which is the gold, which is the metal, down to man? Why add that?
because
It's a good observation.
we are at the bottom of the,
Bottom of the totem pole.
yeah.
Well, in order to be able to understand this, we're going to ask, well, what else does the Bible say about the very end of time? Because maybe this very end of time has something to do with that very end of time. Does that make sense? So if this is the last thing that God wants us to understand in Daniel chapter 2, and this is the last thing God wants us to understand in chapter 7, maybe they are somehow related. So if you looked at Daniel chapter 7, we see this agitation in the Mediterranean area, and we have the first beast come up, and we find out it's Babylon, and that's pretty easy. Historians look at that and say, oh yeah, it's, there's relationships of eagle to the lion, and if you look at the Babylonian cities and their sculptures and their archaeology, yep, it's Babylon, it's really clear. And the same thing when they look at Medo-Persia, yep, it has the issue of the silver, how that's related to Medo-Persia, and of course Greece is in bronze. It has to do with the war, the metals that were used during the war times. So yeah, it's really easy for a non-Christian, non-Jew, just a historian to look at history and go, oh yeah, we can understand that and we can accept that. And including when we get down to the Rome. And so since we're interested in last events, look at Rome. The fourth beast appeared, and it was, I'm just simplifying it in verse 7, terrifying, different from all the other beasts, And then a little horn with eyes like a man and a mouth that spoke the words of arrogance. That's the last thing we see on these beasts, right?
Yeah.
So something about the little horn is related to the iron and the clay. You following that logic? Because it's the last of this sequence of 4. Iron and clay is the last in that sequence in 4. In fact, if you read in chapter 2, the next thing you see is Christ coming. Go ahead, Deborah, if you can find that verse. Like the end of chapter 2 and then the end of chapter 7, where we can see Christ coming. Let me see if I can find it also here. I'll do the Daniel chapter 2. After we read the story about the toes, and verse 42 of Daniel chapter 2, and somebody else can be looking at chapter 7, looking at the end. In verse 44, Daniel chapter 2, it says, "In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed." So, I'll just keep on reading. "It will crush those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it itself will endure forever and ever." This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out to pieces. So, God gives to Daniel the interpretation of that dream of the image. And the very last thing you see before Christ's return is what? The toes. You're okay with that? Megan, you're okay with that too?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that was the interpretation that Daniel gave to King Nebuchadnezzar. Then we go to chapter 7.
I think it's 22.
Verse 22 and verse 7 and chapter 7. Let's see if I can go find that. Put it up on the screen. Okay. So, verse 22 says, "I watched, this horn was waging war against the people and defeating them until," verse 22 says, "until the Ancient of Days came, pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom." So that sounds like that was the end for them. Are we all okay with that? Megan?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
you're okay with that idea?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so if that's the case, and we go back to this, then we have to ask ourselves, when we're trying to interpret the Bible and let the Bible interpret itself, what is the relationship of iron plus clay to this idea of a little horn with eyes like a man and a mouth that spoke words of arrogance?
It's the Antichrist?
Yeah, that would be an easy interpretation.
What did you say, Megan?
The Antichrist?
Antichrist.
Oh, Diane.
That would be something that would stand out that makes sense. But it sounds as though this arrogance, and actually if you look at the Hebrew concept of this, it's the idea of not blasphemy, but boasting. It's pride. And so there's something about this, and in actual fact, go ahead, Deborah, and read a little bit more around this thing about the little horn and that man.
And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. And he shall speak great words against the Most High. And
Wait a second, so that's important. He is referring to the little horn.
Mm-hmm.
Is or a king,
Mm-hmm.
is going to speak words against the Most High. So it's not just arrogance. In addition, he's also going to talk against God. So keep on reading. Yeah.
And shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time.
Okay. So times, and dividing of times, he changed times and laws. Now, an Adventist would look at this, and we're trying to not necessarily impose on Scripture only the Adventist view. That's why I said I'm kind of hedging a little bit. Adventists would look at this and say, clearly it's the Pope, because he wants to change times and laws. He wants to change the 10 Commandments. He wants to change the time from Sunday, from Sabbath to the Sunday. But if you were a non-Adventist, if you were a Buddhist, and you were just reading this for the very first time, it may not seem as obvious, right? Not having had that kind of experience. And so if you were to look at that and you say, well, how are we going to then understand these two? Is there something else that we can turn to that would give us another understanding? And you mentioned it earlier, and that was the book of Revelation. So let's turn to Revelation chapter 13. And we'll start with Revelation chapter 13, verse 1. Because we see a beast that looks very much like the same beast we saw in chapter 7. Remember, it had a bunch of heads, a bunch of horns. In fact, if we were to count all the heads in chapter 7 of those beasts, of all four beasts, count the heads, count the horns, it comes out to be the same number of heads and the same number of horns that we see in Revelation chapter 13. But this time, they're all put together. What could that possibly be when you have a beast that has all these things put together? All the kingdoms of the past that were persecuting God's people now comes together in one big beast. What would that suggest to you? Just let your...
The union.
The union of all... A union of what, though? Because obviously...
Europe.
Yeah, it could be the union of Europe. But I'm thinking that the kingdoms represent persecuting powers of God's people. We're not saying that God's people are Adventist soulmates. All God's people, right? So all God's people in the end are going to be persecuted by some sort of aggregate. When we say aggregate, that means all put together. The worst of Babylon, the worst of Medo-Persia, the worst of Greece, the worst of Rome is all put together in this horrendous beast, and that beast is going to be attacking God's people. Got that? So we're saying, wow, all right, now we have an idea, but there is introduced into this text. Now we'll read the text. Megan, going to want to read that?
Oh yeah, and the dragon stood at the shore of the sea and saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, and 10 crowns on its horns, and each had a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet of those of a bear and a mouth like a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and his great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast.
Okay, so now if we're talking again to this Buddhist person or to a Muslim who has not any clue from our background in Christianity, one of the things we would ask then is, well, now we've introduced a new element, right? A dragon. Where do we see the dragon? You see that in the previous chapter. What do we see? Somebody turn to chapter 12 and tell me what the dragon is. And you can read the verse, whatever. June, if you want to find that verse.
I am looking, hang there.
Number 3.
Verse 3 on chapter 13?
And there
A
appeared
12.
Or 12, okay.
And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads.
So a dragon has how many heads?
7 heads.
10 horns.
And
How
7
many
crowns.
heads do we have here? 7 heads, 10 horns. And what do we have back in Daniel chapter 7? Remember? If you add up all the heads, there were 7 heads. Because on one of the beasts there was 3 heads.
Oh yeah.
Okay, and so if you add up all the heads in Daniel 7, there's 7 heads, and we add up all the horns in Daniel chapter 7, there's 10 horns. So what the Bible is saying, seems to be saying, is that these elements seem to be connected somehow.
They're all one and the same.
They're all one and the same, but this particular combination is connected with the dragon.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now, who's the dragon in Revelation chapter 12?
Satan.
Where does it say that?
Well, it was because on number 4 it says, and his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and it did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered for her son, to devour her son as soon as it was born. But I recognize that the 3rd of the stars, the 3rd of angels, taken
So
from.
where else does it say that the devil is the dragon, though? Where in that text?
Is that he stood before the woman? I would assume.
Keep going, it's a little bit later.
On number 9 it says, and the great dragon was casted out, that old serpent called the devil.
There you go. Verse 9. So now if you're talking, basically we're going through as though we're going to be giving a Bible study to somebody who has not come from our background. Where would you start then to put this puzzle together?
Daniel.
You could start with Daniel. You might.
Actually,
Where would you start?
I'm trying to think of what I'm drawing a blank here.
Yeah.
It's the book that talks about what happened and the failure in heaven. So,
Not an Adventist book though.
no, the
Okay.
Bible.
Yeah.
It tells about Lucifer being cast out of heaven.
Oh, well, Revelation 12 is the best one for cast out of heaven. You also see Isaiah.
Isaiah, that's it.
In Ezekiel, 28, and Isaiah 14 as well. But Revelation 12 is probably the strongest verse that we have about Satan being cast out of heaven. And then we have this image here. And sometimes I think maybe if I was to give a Bible study to a non-Christian, or even a Christian who's not familiar with these things, I might even start with Revelation chapter 12. This is pretty clear who the devil is, right? And it's pretty clear that the dragon is connected to this sea beast. And this beast comes out of the sea, just like the beast in chapter 12, or chapter 7 of Daniel. So they both come out of the sea. They all have similar characteristics. They're all persecuting God's people, right? And so I guess what my point is, without Ellen White, without Adventist literature, without any of this stuff around us, how do you approach people to help them understand? Megan was asking the question at the very beginning about the idea of the state of the dead, and one of the Bible studies that she's connected to. How would you explain to those people some of these concepts and not bring in to the discussion any other literature other than what you have available to you? And you could actually use the dictionary, the encyclopedia, about the different kingdoms.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating to see how the dragon is connected to this whole story. Satan is behind all these kingdoms, according to Revelation chapter 12. Isn't that amazing? Satan is the one. And what's interesting though is this beast that we see coming out of the sea in Revelation 13 is a new beast that happens at the end of time. It's an aggregate. It's an aggregate of all the bad stuff we've seen in the past. And so we don't have time to get into all those details. But I want to just encourage you to use the Bible. And if necessary, if you have no other choice, the Bible alone, it's easy to turn to things like Ellen White and other places. But if you could just use the Bible alone, start with something like this so you could show the connections, right, across all. So if you were now to look at the toes, how many toes do we typically see on most people, except if you're using AI imaging?
10.
Somehow when I use AI imaging to create pictures, I get 12 toes, I get 15 toes,
Wow.
I get 6 fingers on each hand. That's just AI.
It'll be 10.
AI hasn't figured that out. But you see in Revelation, there's also a discussion about 10 kings at the very end of the world. Where do you see that in Revelation? So look in Revelation, see if you can find 10 kings.
I was just thinking I would show them Revelation 13:4 that talks about it's a worshiping power.
Very good. So would you start with that, or would you start with Revelation 13 and then work backwards and then work forwards?
Well, yeah, because 10.
10 doesn't help us a whole lot. Talks about prophesy again, nations, kindreds, tongues, and peoples, but it doesn't help us understand the dragon and these different beasts. What we're looking for in Revelation is something to do with 10 kings. Maybe you find it in Revelation chapter 17. back to this.
Oh, I see 10 horns.
Where is that?
That's 17:12. It says,
It's a real important, that's an important one, because it's a little different than what we're discussing here, but that's an important one. We go back here, Revelation, what was it, 12 what?
17:12 starts talking about 10 horns, which have received no kingdom as of yet, but
Okay, good.
receive power of kings 1 hour with the beast.
There you go. I can't, for some reason, my Bible tells me I can't do that.
And it says, these have one mind, and they shall give their power and strength unto the beast.
Okay, let's go, if my thing will cooperate, let's go, like this. Revelation.
It's 17:7 starts off, the mystery of the woman and the beast is explained.
There we go. All right, so here Revelation 17 talks, and you see this woman, what's her name? Babylon the Great. Does that ring a bell? We just got through talking about Babylon in Daniel 2, Daniel 7. Then you talked about she's riding this beast, comes out of the abyss this time, doesn't come out of the sea, comes out of the abyss, so it seems to be, is changed, it is morphed into something else. But then it goes down here and it talks about 10 kings, verse 12. The 10 horns, did we see 10 horns someplace else?
Yeah, she read that one of the 10 horns that those
Right,
10
okay.
kings.
So the 10 horns you saw are 10 kings which have not yet received a kingdom. So is that past or future? That's future to 17 in any case. They have one purpose, to give their power and authority to the beast. And they will wage war. Who are they waging war against?
The Lamb.
The Lamb. So it's again that same theme against God's people. And it says that the waters you saw, the prostitute sits, or the peoples, etc., etc. So, going back to this idea of the puzzle, we have now pieces of the puzzle that are starting to give us a sense of the frame in which we can understand Daniel chapter 2, chapter 7, Revelation 13, Revelation 17. There's still how to figure out chronology, in which order do these things happen. We still haven't quite figured out yet what the 10 toes represent. Not that we understand it represents the kingdom, because the Bible says it represents the kingdom, but we don't quite yet know, we haven't figured out what the clay means. Going back to what Deborah was saying, later on it seems to be some sort of mixture of religion with politics, right? You see that in Revelation chapter 13, where it talks about this mixture of religion and politics, which are going to persecute God's people. Revelation 17, politics and religion going to persecute God's people. So that's chapter 17. So 13, 17, and even possibly Daniel chapter 7, where that little horn could suggest also religion and politics. So we haven't in this Sabbath school class, which you normally would do over across many different days of study,
How do you
talked about
draw?
all this, huh?
How do you draw the politics part to it? And maybe I'm just looking
Yeah.
for the exact word politics, but
The politics is kingdoms.
Oh,
So
okay.
if you look at Babylon, that's civil politics. Those are civil governments.
oh, okay.
And they all have idolatry connected, right? From Babylon all the way down to Greece, down to Rome, there's idolatry all the way through. All of them have idols. And so we have to ask
All of them have
ourselves, idols.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So we're trying to figure out, what does Babylon, Greece, and Rome, and Medo-Persia, how does that become how do they become persecutors of God's people? That means we have to go another layer. We have to have another Sabbath school class to discuss that. But what I'm trying to encourage you to do is, without too much outside interference, use reason and the Bible alone to be able to come to conclusions that you can help other people understand what you believe.
That's really important.
Yeah.
It is.
Yes.
And we are pretty much at the very end. Any comments or suggestions or ideas?
I would just say, to answer your question, 14:8 talks about Babylon, but it talks about how she made the nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. So like she was influencing nations.
And that's a
as far as
sense of
political powers.
Okay.
Yeah, and of course we'll see how 17 is encouraging you to worship. There's a mixture of politics and religion all the way through these different verses in Revelation, which we don't see clearly in Daniel. We don't necessarily see the religion side. If you look at the little horn, you don't necessarily see religion. We have to come to that conclusion outside of Daniel.
All right.
All right. Well, good.